Welcome to another episode of Scottish Murders. After the three-part Liam Fee episodes, which I know were extremely hard to listen to at times, and where I really tried to put you in the shoes of the juror, which would have been horrendous, and we know how it affected at least one of the jurors involved, for this episode I'm taking us back to the 1800s, specifically 1883, and while it's still an episode about a murder, it's not quite as harrowing. Next week, I will be releasing a Scotland Then episode, highlighting stories printed in Scottish newspapers at the time of this episode's murder, including a poem that brought a cheeky smile to my face and a nod of knowing exactly how the writer felt. But first, the murder of 22-year-old Grace Hamilton in Glasgow on Friday the 7th of December 1883, with Grace being a rising theatrical artiste, and the motive being thought to be one as old as the Scottish mountains and as relevant today as it was back then: jealousy. I sourced all of the information for this episode from the British Newspaper Archive, which I use all the time, and many of these older cases I like to cover would be lost without these resources. Janet Russell was born in 1861 into a well-connected, respectable family in Liverpool, with her father being a printer and her grandfather being a master printer. Janet, from a young age, her two older sisters, her mother, father and grandfather, were frequent visitors at Millport, which according to Wikipedia is the only town on the island of Great Cumbrae, in the Firth of Clyde off the coast of mainland Scotland, and would spend many a holiday at Millport. Sadly, Janet's father died when she was still a child, at which point Janet, her sisters and her mother were brought under the care of Janet's grandfather. Despite the loss of Janet's father, the family continued to holiday at Millport, and it was here, when Janet was still a child, she first became acquainted with Galbraith Macpherson, a well-connected gentleman from Glasgow who was 8 years older than Janet, and who also frequented Millport. The pair became friends, and would enjoy spending time together when holidaying in Millport, but the pair grew apart when their lives went in different directions. Over time, Janet's sisters married and left home until there was only Janet and her mother under the care of her grandfather. Janet's grandfather was not, however, in the best of health, and so he decided to set Janet's mother up in business, starting her up in a tobacconist's business in a watering place near Liverpool, with Janet and her mother moving into the residence above the business together. But Janet had her sights set on more than just living above a tobacconist's business with her mother, and surprised everyone when she announced she was getting married at the age of 16, a fact that immensely displeased her family, with it being reported in the Evening Gazette Aberdeen on the 10th of December 1883 that her future husband was an officer on board a merchant vessel, either a mate or an engineer. Undeterred by her family's displeasure with her prospective marriage, with it not being reported exactly why her family were displeased with this pairing, only that they felt it was foolish and hasty, Janet went ahead and married this man, and the pair moved in together in Liverpool. This was a relatively short-lived marriage, though, with it being reported that subsequent events had displeased Janet's family further, leading to Janet and her husband separating. Following the breakdown of her marriage, Janet appeared to want to distance herself from her family, moving from Liverpool to London, and over time they lost touch with Janet, believing that she was taking rather questionable courses in her life. One course she took that her family did not approve of, although I wouldn't call it questionable, but maybe it was because of her background and the family she came from, was to change her name from Janet Russell to Grace Hamilton and take to the stage in London, making her debut, according to the Weekly Scotsman, in a play at Drury Lane Theatre in London, with her subsequently playing minor parts, including at the Royal Comedy Theatre and the Stand Theatre in London. Janet, or Grace, seemed to be living her best life, enjoying her work immensely, socialising, visiting Millport for holidays again, and she had even become reacquainted with her old friend Galbraith Macpherson, who, upon returning to Glasgow after travelling and finding out she was separated and living and working in London, had immediately visited London and renewed their friendship. And since then, Janet, or Grace, and Galbraith had been communicating regularly, although the friendship had lost some of its easiness, and a gap between the two appeared to have formed. Janet was 22 when she accepted the role to play a fairy in the pantomime of Cinderella at the Grand Theatre in Glasgow, her first ever pantomime part, with it being said she was perfect for the role, with her being, according to an article in the North British Daily Mail on the 8th of December 1883, a beautiful, well-proportioned female with light hair and fair complexion. Despite the growing distance between Galbraith and Janet, upon finding out that his friend Janet had accepted this pantomime role in Glasgow, a part that Galbraith insisted Janet would be perfect for, Galbraith insisted he would find appropriate accommodation in Glasgow for Janet, with the pair possibly hoping that their previously close friendship could be rekindled. Galbraith Macpherson was brought up in Glasgow by his mum and dad, who were well known and respectable, with his father having his own business as a master coppersmith in Southside. Galbraith was a popular boy and man, with him forming both numerous and lasting relationships from his school days, some of whom would accompany Galbraith and his family on their yearly trips to Millport, where he met many people he went on to have long and lasting friendships with, one being Janet Russell. Upon leaving school, Galbraith went to sea as an apprentice, making a couple of long voyages, visiting such places as India, before returning home and entering into employment at his father's business. However, Galbraith missed the sea, missed the adventure, and soon left his father's employment and went back to the sea, again making a couple of long voyages, before he was summoned home in 1877 when he was 24 years old due to the sad passing of his father. Galbraith was desperate to go back to the sea again, and made arrangements to depart as soon as possible with another ship. However, the settling of his father's affairs took longer than he had expected, and the ship had to sail without him. This circumstance in turn led to Galbraith giving up the sea once and for all, but it would not mean he would be staying in Glasgow for long. Galbraith had been left reasonably well off financially upon his father's death, with it being estimated that his yearly income would be about £100, which in today's money would be about £10,200 or about $12,900. Having missed out on going to sea, Galbraith debated what he would do instead, as he didn't see himself staying long in Glasgow. He firstly decided to take a trip to his favourite holiday destination, Millport, where he met up again with his friend Janet, who told him she was soon to be married. Galbraith congratulated his friend before returning to Glasgow, and then making the decision to travel to Demerara in Guyana, where he stayed for about 5 years as a sugar plantation overseer, returning back to Glasgow at the beginning of summer 1882 in a bid to escape the yellow fever pandemic that was raging in the island, staying with his mother, who was now living at Pollock Street, Southside in Glasgow. Upon returning from Demerara and finding out that his friend, Janet Russell, was now living and working in London, he made his way there to renew their friendship, with the pair frequently corresponding once he returned back to Glasgow. Upon hearing that the part of her fairy was available in an upcoming pantomime in Glasgow, Galbraith immediately wrote to Janet insisting that she would be perfect for this role. And so, upon Janet auditioning for and accepting this part, Galbraith was delighted and immediately set about securing Janet accommodation in Glasgow. From now on, I'm going to call Janet Russell Grace Hamilton, as that is what everyone, including Galbraith, referred to her as, unbeknownst to many that her real name was Janet Russell. The pantomime of Cinderella was due to open on Saturday the 8th of December 1883 at the Grand Theatre Cowcaddens, which, according to an article in bbc.co.uk, opened in 1881 and had a capacity for 2,030 people. And so 22-year-old Grace Hamilton arrived with Galbraith Macpherson at her lodgings in Gladstone Street, located in a quiet middle-class street in the northwestern portion of Glasgow, apparently about a 5-minute walk from the Grand Theatre and a few paces from St George's Cross, on Wednesday the 28th of November. 2 weeks prior, Galbraith Macpherson had secured the top-floor flat, parlour and best bedroom of house number 32 on the north side of Gladstone Street for Grace Hamilton, which was tenanted by Mr. James Deans, a clerk, his wife Mrs. Deans, who was in the habit of letting rooms to members of dramatic companies who visited Glasgow, and their adult son, who was also involved with theatrical work. Mrs. Deans was reported to be a respectable woman, and the flats at 32 Gladstone Street, which were let in suites of 3 or 4 rooms, being tenanted by a respectable class of people, with the shared staircase and landings being kept clean and tidy. Upon Grace arriving at Gladstone Street and Galbraith introducing Grace to Mrs. Deans, he began to settle Grace and her luggage in, making sure she had everything she needed and was comfortable before taking his leave for the day, although he would be back every single day, either visiting Grace while she rehearsed at the theatre in the evenings into the early hours of the morning, or calling on her at her flat on afternoons to take her for a drive or a walk, with Grace confiding in Mrs. Deans within the first week of her arriving at Gladstone Street, according to an article in the Weekly Scotsman, that despite her and Galbraith being on friendly terms since they had been children, lately, due largely to his unrelenting attention towards Grace, she had begun to be afraid of him, leading her to try and avoid Galbraith, a fact that Galbraith did not appreciate. From the moment Grace arrived in Glasgow on the 28th of November, Galbraith was ever present at Grace's side throughout the day and night, and while Grace tried to detach herself from Galbraith's attentions, he apparently was doing the opposite, proudly telling people about the intimacy he perceived he had with Grace, and proudly showing his companions a ring he was wearing, saying that Gracie had given it to him. But Galbraith's apparent doting attentions of Grace would soon reach boiling point, when on the evening of Thursday the 6th of December, when Grace was at rehearsals, again with Galbraith being present, she received a bouquet of flowers from an admirer. Galbraith apparently flew into a rage and became violent, striking Grace over the back with a stick. Grace was furious, and a quarrel ensued, resulting in Grace telling him to leave and never to come near her again. But before Galbraith parted, he made a threat that left Grace feeling that his mind had become affected, and she endeavoured to avoid seeing him again at all costs. However, this would be easier said than done, as it became clear from that very evening's antics by Galbraith that he wouldn't be avoided so easily. As midnight on Thursday came around, Grace's rehearsals at the theatre continued, with Grace actually not returning back to her flat until 4 a.m. on Friday morning. However, despite Grace not being at her flat, Galbraith still made his presence very much known to the Deanses. As Mr. and Mrs. Deans and their son were happily tucked up in bed, just before midnight on Thursday, they were rudely awakened by a ringing of their doorbell. As James Deans had been sick in bed for several weeks, Mrs. Deans got up and answered the doorbell, where she was faced with an inebriated Galbraith Macpherson, asking if Grace was home. Slightly irritated at being woken up, Mrs. Deans curtly informed Galbraith that she was not, that she was at the theatre rehearsing and was not expected back until about 6 a.m. in the morning. Upon hearing this, Galbraith left, before returning again half an hour later and ringing the doorbell at the top floor flat, again waking the family. This time the Deans' adult son answered the door and again informed Galbraith that Grace was not in and was not expected back until the early hours of the morning, and that the family would be obliged if he would stop ringing the doorbell. To which Galbraith muttered thank you before again making his way back down the close to the street. But that wouldn't be the last time the Deans' doorbell was buzzed that night, as Galbraith came back to the flat on several occasions throughout the night until about 3:30 a.m. But the Deans paid him no attention and assumed that he would eventually go home. However, when Grace returned from rehearsals alone at 4 a.m. that morning, she found Galbraith sitting at the foot of the close stairs, waiting for her. Tired and annoyed, Grace ignored Galbraith and began to climb the stairs to her flat, with Galbraith following close behind, begging her to let him into the flat so he could have a drink of stout that he knew the Deans kept in the flat. Grace refused, however, saying, according to the North British Daily Mail, "Oh no, I can't do that. What would Mrs. Deans say if I took you at this time of night?" before turning and letting herself into the flat and heading to bed, hoping that Galbraith would take the hint and go home. At about 9:30 a.m. on Friday the 7th of December, the doorbell of the flat rang again, but on answering, Mrs. Deans was pleased to see that it was just the postman bringing a letter for Grace, and so Mrs. Deans immediately took the letter into Grace's room. Grace was awake, and so the two women began to chat, with Mrs. Deans telling Grace about the disturbance during the night from Galbraith, and Grace telling Mrs. Deans that he had still been waiting in the close when she arrived home at 4 a.m. Grace also informed Mrs. Deans of the rage and violence Galbraith had shown towards her at the theatre the night before telling her that as Galbraith left the theatre, he had threatened to poison himself. Mrs. Deans laughed at this, thinking it nonsense, But Grace was very serious and said to Mrs. Deans, "Don't laugh at the idea. It's quite probably that he may do it, for he is insane," and that she believed his mind had become affected. Thinking no more of this, Mrs. Deans left Grace's room and Grace went back to sleep. At about 2 p.m. on Friday the 7th of December, the doorbell rang, and upon Mrs. Deans answering it, she was faced again with Galbraith Macpherson. This time, though, he appeared to be sober. Galbraith requested to see Grace, who Mrs. Deans said was still in bed, but Galbraith insisted that he come in and wait in the parlour for her to waken up, and so Mrs. Deans showed him into the parlour, before returning to the kitchen to continue working, along with Mrs. Mary McIntyre, a charwoman, who assisted Mrs. Deans with household cleaning and tasks. However, she had barely stepped into the kitchen before Galbraith was at the kitchen door, requesting again to speak to Mrs. Deans in the parlour, where he proceeded to apologise for his conduct the previous night and into the early hours, saying that he had not been sensible of what he was doing, having been under the influence of drink at the time, going on to explain to Mrs. Deans that before the previous night he had not taken drink for a very long time, saying that when he took drink it went to his brain and that he did not know what he was doing, and that "my head's all in a muddle." Mrs. Deans told him that she accepted his apology and hoped that the same thing would not occur again, with Galbraith replying that it would not. He then asked Mrs. Deans if he would go and see if Grace was awake and let her know that he wanted to speak to her immediately, to which Mrs. Deans agreed. Grace was awake but still in bed when Mrs. Deans entered her room, and she reluctantly agreed to see Galbraith, wanting to talk to him about his violence the previous evening and the disturbance through the night, and so asked Mrs. Deans to show him into her bedroom, as she was hoping to go back to sleep after her talk with Galbraith. Galbraith then entered Grace's bedroom, and Mrs. Deans returned to the kitchen. About 20 minutes later, Mrs. Deans and Mary McIntyre were working in the kitchen when a report was heard, which sounded like something falling, with Mrs. Deans hurrying from the kitchen to the parlour, imagining that something had fallen, but finding nothing amiss in the parlour, she next knocked at Grace's bedroom door, and Galbraith called out, "Come in, Mrs. Deans." She found Galbraith sitting on a chair in front of the bed, and Grace was on the bed with the covers over her head. Galbraith said, smiling, "Oh, don't be the least alarmed. I am only doing something to frighten Miss Hamilton." Hesitating, Mrs. Deans looked at Grace in the bed again, feeling something wasn't right, but had started to leave the room before turning and speaking to Grace and saying, "What has happened? What has he been doing to you?" But there was no reply. While Galbraith still sat calmly on the chair at the end of the bed, Mrs. Deans approached the bed, and upon removing the covers from Grace's face and head, she was horrified to see Grace lying on her bed with her eyes closed and her pallor being quite white. But it was the blood that was seeping from a bullet wound in front of Grace's right ear into her hair and onto the pillow and blankets that sent a stab of fear through Mrs. Deans, and she screamed and ran from the room to get help. But as soon as she left the room, Galbraith banged the door shut behind her. By this time, Mrs. McIntyre had left the kitchen and was now in the hallway outside Grace's room, and Mrs. Deans began to tell her, "He has shot Miss Hamilton," but the pair jumped in fright as they heard another report sound out from a pistol, coming from behind Grace's now closed bedroom door. In a panic, Mrs. Deans told Mrs. McIntyre to stand in front of Grace's bedroom door and not let Galbraith leave, while she ran down the stairs out into the street in search of a police officer. She wouldn't be searching long, as nearby at St. George's Cross, Mrs. Deans came across 2 police constables and immediately told them what had happened, and the trio ran back to the top-floor flat as quickly as possible. Upon entering Grace's bedroom, the 2 police constables found Grace Hamilton dead in her bed, and Galbraith Macpherson lying on the floor with a bullet wound in his right temple and a large portion of his brain protruding and blood flowing over the hearthrug and carpet, and a pistol was lying by his right hand, a 6-chambered revolver. At this point, Galbraith was unconscious but still alive, but he died within minutes. The nearest doctor was immediately called, but upon examining both bodies, he pronounced both to be extinct. On closer examination of the room, a hastily scribbled note was found on a desk, addressed to Galbraith's mother, which read, "Forgive me, mother, for what I am about to do." It was determined that there were no marks on Grace that would suggest a struggle had ensued before she was shot, that an attempt had been made to muffle the first shot by using the bedclothes, and that both deaths would have followed immediately on their injuries. However, it was deemed unnecessary for a post-mortem inspection of the bodies to be carried out. What was deemed necessary, though, was the sensational and attention-grabbing headlines, such as "Tragedy was enacted which thrilled inhabitants of Glasgow last night with horror," and "Great excitement was caused in Glasgow by the announcement that Galbraith Macpherson had murdered Grace Hamilton," and "The tragedy has created a great sensation." And a reporter even visited the top-floor Gladstone flat the day after Grace was murdered, where they not only spoke to Mrs. Deans, but they went into Grace's bedroom where she was murdered and poked around. But I'll come back to that in a minute. Much was also made in the newspapers of the pair's relationship, seeking to determine exactly what their relationship was, but determined that Galbraith had been a gentleman who went about in a quiet manner, and Grace had a prepossessing appearance and great personal attractions. With an article in the Open Times in Argyllshire Advertiser on the 15th of December 1883 reading, "The unfortunate man Macpherson, who murdered the actress in Glasgow on Friday, is well known in this locality, where several of his relatives occupy respectable positions. Those who knew him well describe him as a very steady young man of slender build, who was greatly esteemed by all who he came in contact with his large circle of acquaintances who had knowledge of his character attributing the rash deed to a fit of insanity." Despite Galbraith's acquaintances feeling the motive for the murder of Grace and then shooting himself had been insanity, speculation didn't stop there. Could it have been jealousy? We heard how he had been besotted with Grace, wanting to spend all his time with her, but Grace was pulling away, becoming fearful of Galbraith and his violent outbursts. Or was it the fact that Galbraith had started drinking again, with him saying that he hadn't touched a drop for some time because it affected his mind and he didn't know what he was doing? Or was his mind affected despite him drinking, as Grace had told Mrs. Deans she felt Galbraith to be insane? The general consensus was summed up in the North British Daily Mail on the 8th of December when it said, "The motive of the crime has been generally attributed to jealousy, but from what has to be said, it will appear that the case may be traced to a partially disordered brain." Nobody will ever know exactly what triggered Galbraith Macpherson to shoot Grace and himself on Friday the 7th of December 1883, the day before the pantomime Cinderella that Grace had rehearsed so hard for was due to open. The opening was postponed, though, for a week. So back to the reporter who visited the flat and bedroom where Grace was not only murdered the night before, but where both bodies had only been removed 2 hours prior, with the article in the North British Daily Mail setting the scene by describing the ascent up the close stairs, saying that everything was now back to normal in the close other than the dirty marks of many feet on the steps, and a great splash of clotted blood on one of the landing places. I'm not sure where this clotted blood came from, as the shootings didn't take place on the landings. The reporter then rang the top-floor bell and was ushered in by Mrs. Deans, who went on to talk feelingly about Grace Hamilton, describing her as one of the most beautiful creatures she had ever seen, and being a lady in every sense of the word. The reporter then went to the bedroom where Grace had been shot, saying that the room presented a melancholy appearance. The reporter then described how the bloodied bedclothes had been removed from the room, with only the mattress, which was saturated with blood nearest the head of the iron bedspread, still present on the bed. On the desk in which Galbraith had left the note to his mother were 3 small framed photographs, which showed Grace in 3 different characters and attitudes, with them apparently being very pleasing to look upon. Also having been removed from the bedroom were wearing apparel that had belonged to Grace, which had been piled up in the lobby outside Grace's bedroom, as well as little memorials, including a well-handled proof sheet of the parts of the Cinderella pantomime in which Grace was to have appeared as a fairy. The same reporter in the same article also mentioned something quite interesting that I went in search for. They reminded the reader about a deed somewhat similar in character to the one committed at Gladstone Street that had been committed in a nearby street not longer ago than a year or at most 18 months, and of another tragedy that again had happened in a nearby street 4 or 5 years since, a tragedy which at the time was called the Gilfillan Mystery, a mystery that apparently had not yet been explained. So 2 similar crimes and a mystery having taken place in the same vicinity within the past 4 or 5 years. I was intrigued. Well, it turned out that the first crime hadn't been committed not longer ago than a year or at most 18 months, but instead only 8 months prior in March 1883, when about 9 p.m. one evening, again in a very respectable locality, landlady, 40-year-old Miss Sarah Jack, was shot by one of her lodgers, who, according to an article in the Glasgow Weekly Mail on the 3rd of March 1883, was a respectable, connected young man of 35 years of age called John Robb, following which John Robb turned the gun on himself, dying instantly from shooting himself in the head. Miss Sarah Jack, however, while severely injured, was still alive. John Robb had been lodging with Sarah Jack for quite some time, but he had apparently begun to drink heavily following losing his full-time employment at a solicitor's in December 1882, and having only been able to secure a part-time job in an insurance office since. He had begun to drink more and more, despite Sarah Jack saying he would have to leave the house if his drinking did not stop. Not paying a blind bit of notice, on Tuesday the 27th of February 1883, John Robb returned to his lodging house about 8 p.m. after spending the evening drinking in a maudlin condition. Upon entering his lodging house, his hand was noticed to be bleeding. Apparently he had accidentally cut his hand on his penknife. Another lodger dressed his wound for him, and the pair shared another drink until shortly before 9 p.m. when John Robb retired to his bedroom. Apparently, it was the landlady's job to get the lodgers' beds ready for them on an evening, and so she made her way to John Robb's bedroom just before 9 p.m, having heard him go to his room. As she entered his room, she noticed nothing unusual, and John Robb was standing, swaying slightly not far from her. She went about getting his bed ready, but as she was shaking up the mattress, she noticed John Robb reach for something behind his back. Before she could react upon seeing he was holding a revolver and pointing it at her, he discharged the weapon, with the bullet striking Sarah Jack in front of her left ear. John Robb then put the pistol to his head and fired, dropping immediately to the floor. John Robb survived for a short while, but he never regained consciousness and died on the way to the hospital in the ambulance. While Sarah Jack had been struck by the bullet, she was still alive and quickly got to her feet and ran down the stairs, with blood streaming from the bullet wound, looking for help. Sarah Jack was taken to the Western Infirmary by 2 police officers in a cab, and it was reported 4 days after the shooting that Sarah Jack was expected to recover. However, 3 weeks after the shooting, it was reported in the Kirkcaldy Times on the 21st of March that Miss Sarah Jack had died, with it being stated that her cause was hopeless from the first. Now, the second crime that happened in the same respectable locality was the Gilfillan mystery, which occurred in January 1878, so more than 5.5 years before Grace Hamilton was murdered. This one is quite a convoluted story, but basically the only mystery about this case appeared to be whether it was James Stewart and 3 accomplices, Bridget, Margaret and Elizabeth, to blame for the almost 70-year-old respectable James Gilfillan falling down a closest back stairs and falling unconscious, or whether James Stewart and his accomplices in fact pushed James Gilfillan down the stairs, or whether an extremely drunk James Gilfillan fell down the back stairs himself after being led to the close and robbed of half his clothes and valuables by James Stewart and his accomplices, or whether it was the police's fault for assuming that James was just a drunk and had keeled over from the drink and not from a fall down the stairs, when they found an unconscious James Gilfillan lying at the bottom of the stairs about an hour after he had been robbed, and instead of seeking James Gilfillan medical assistance, had instead placed him in the cells, where he was found dead the next morning. James Stewart, Bridget McDermott, Margaret Morrison and Elizabeth Duffy were arrested and went to trial on a robbery and murder charge, but upon the jury hearing all the evidence, such as the medical evidence, that supported the theory that James Gilfillan had come by his wounds through a fall, suggesting that following him being relieved of his property, he was left alone and fell down the stairs himself, heavily under the influence of liquor, the jury made the decision to find Stuart James and his 3 accomplices innocent of both robbery and murder, and they only found them guilty of theft. The police's actions of not seeking medical attention for James Gilfillan was also called into question, many deeming their actions reprehensible. But following the medical evidence deeming it having been impossible for James Gilfillan to have recovered no matter how careful treatment he might have received, and upon it being adopted by police in Glasgow to carry out a different mode of treating persons supposed to be unconscious through drink, unrest and anger began to abate. So back to December 1883, and upon it being discovered that Grace Hamilton was in fact a stage name and Grace's real name had been Janet Russell, her grandfather in Liverpool was contacted by police authorities to let him know Janet's body was ready to be collected for her funeral. Sadly though, as I said previously, Janet's grandfather wasn't in the best of health and had been in his bed ill for the previous 6 weeks. And so he communicated to the Glasgow police that he would search for Janet's estranged husband and her mother, and if they could be found, he would send them to Glasgow. 3 days later, it was reported that Janet's uncle and aunt had arrived in Glasgow to take charge of her body. 22-year-old Janet Russell's remains were interred in Sighthill Cemetery, Glasgow, following her funeral, which was attended by managers and gentlemen of the Grand Theatre Company. A floral cross was placed on Janet's coffin as a token of friendship and companions in the theatrical profession. Next week, there will be a Scotland Then episode from December 1883. Thanks for listening to another episode of Scottish Murders, the twice award shortlisted fortnightly podcast that brings to light the stories of victims and their relentless pursuit for justice. If this case has captivated you, then don't forget to tell a friend to listen or check out scottishmurders.com so together we can share more Scottish Murders. Until next time, I've been your host, Dawn.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.